All right, well, we welcome you back to another discussion. Joe and Josh discuss Genesis, and we are now in Genesis chapter 42. So, just to catch us up with the context, Pharaoh has already told Joseph his dreams, and Joseph has had a chance to respond to those dreams. We now know that God has given Pharaoh forewarning that 7 years of plenty are coming and 7 years of famine. And we've already somehow very quickly gotten through the 7 years of plenty, which was covered really quickly. And now we are in the midst of the 7 years of famine. I don't know, Joe, if you know how deep we are into it, but it's deep enough for it to be felt in the land of Canaan and for Joseph's birth family to begin to wonder where they're going to get food. So that's where we are. Do you have any other things we should catch up on?
Well, definitely want to recall too that Joseph's sons are born in the years of plenty, which is something significant to remember, because the days are coming where it's difficult, and in the last chapter 41, it definitely says that people were coming from all over the world to Egypt for the food. So for
Right.
the
And
good.
the world in this time is pretty much the Mediterranean Sea and the countries surrounding it. So it's a pretty widespread famine if that's meant to be taken literally, but it also could be hyperbole.
Mhm.
Either way would be fine. And I guess we didn't talk about this last time, Joe, but I've been thinking about this idea that Joseph had a tough life. Up to this point, he hasn't had, I mean, he's been successful in the things he's done, but he's been successful in some places he would never have chosen to be.
Mm.
A lot of us live lives like that. But he enters into this season, however short, that there's a lot of blessing, and he names one of his sons to forget, more or less.
Mhm.
And he's saying that the season of plenty has allowed him to forget his suffering, to forget his misery. And there's a redemptiveness to that. It reminds me a little bit of Hebrews chapter 12 when the writer says that for the joy set before him, Christ Jesus endured the cross.
Mhm.
It's this idea that if we know what's ahead and what's ahead is good and positive, we can endure a lot more. And there's a sense that Joseph treated those 7 years of plenty, they were good years for him. He
Mhm.
almost forgot all of his travails. I wonder if that's something that we can hope for. I mean, there's no guarantee that our bad times will ever get better.
Mhm.
But if we have any listeners who are in some dark times, Joseph spent most of his life. I mean, he had a good childhood. At least he was favored among his father's sons, but he spent a lot of years in pretty miserable conditions.
Mhm.
But he was allowed a season where he could forget that for a period of time. It must have been good years for Joseph.
Yeah, and usually, let's face it, children can bring out those things for us too. That I've seen many of people who have had some difficulties in life, or some personal struggles, where the children actually, just the fact of being responsible and having to look at life a little differently. It's not all self-centered or narcissistic. It's more along the lines of you have something you have to take care of, and you have to foster a good life into. So I think these things help him to these children, these being married in this situation, helped them to see that the current suffering, or the suffering that he had in the past, was bigger than him, which I think is good to remember at this point, because there's people do struggle with things in life, and it's helpful for us to see that he learned from that,
Yeah.
rather than just being bitter. I mean, there's bitterness and revenge and all these sort of things that people thrive on sometimes when they hear stories or watch movies, and you would anticipate some type of this in the story, but we see Joseph, should we say, rise above,
Yeah, or
or
letting
grow from
go.
it.
In some ways, he's letting go of those past
Mm.
griefs and pains. And I know we're taught today to never forget our past, and we shouldn't. I mean, what's the old cliche? Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it.
Mhm.
but still there's a sense in which we have to let go of some of those pains if we're ever going to enjoy the moment or find peace where we are. And Joseph, this is a season in which he began to let go. And we can see that because we're going to enter into the confrontation he has with his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still carrying, as we'll see over and over again, a lot of fear and guilt over what they did. But as the story progresses, we'll see that Joseph has let go of a lot of that. And I think that is foreshadowed for us
Mm-hmm.
in the naming of his children, in the way in which he was allowing, however brief this season of God's blessing, it was only going to be 7 years, but he really allowed it to bring some healing to him.
Right.
I think that's the significance of the name of his son.
Yeah. Also, it's significant to realize too, he doesn't blame God for it. Where a lot
Right.
of people in our culture spend a lot of time blaming their parents or blaming the creator for their problems or the outcomes that have come. Uh,
Yeah. We, of course, live after a lot more history with God than Joseph did. So maybe Joseph didn't have the expectations that God would deliver him from these things. Maybe that's a little harder for those of us who live after the life and ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and we have so much history in the scriptures to go back to. Maybe we expect God to be more involved in delivering us from these things. Maybe the difference in history was a difference in expectation. But Joseph, you're right. He had every reason to blame his brothers, which you can tell he does to some degree. But he blames God. Well, I don't want to anticipate it too much. He does bring God into it. He does see God at work, but it's not in his sufferings so much.
Either that or it's pretty silent. I mean, I wish that you probably wish, or maybe other people wish that it was more explicit how he was able to overcome the rejection of his brothers being thrown into the cisterns
Yeah, we
and then
only get some tantalizing clues, which will come up in a few chapters. But yeah, nothing specific. There's a lot of unspoken things. I'm still very curious. I don't know if you are, as to what the nature of this famine was.
Mhm.
Like, what is it amazing we're not given any details at all? We don't know if it was a lack of water or too much water. We don't know if it was brought on by pestilence or disease. We don't know if there was just a radical, because as I'm thinking through it, I mean, the Mediterranean is a diverse region with lots of different climates based on where it is. And it's not as though Morocco is always the same climate as France, is always the same climate as, Turkey. Today, they can be dramatically different. So something that would affect this entire region is quite interesting. I'd like to know more details, but we're not told at all. And of
Father.
course, the famine could have been localized to just areas close in proximity to Egypt, where Egypt was closer to them than other places. But when you think of the land of Canaan, which is where Jacob is, he may be living pretty far south. So maybe Egypt is most useful place to go. But they're also the region of the Hittites in the north, and they're pretty prosperous people. So you'd think that he would have had options, especially when he ran into the trouble in Egypt. If they had another option, you'd think they would have gone there. It makes me think this famine is really widespread. But I'm getting us a little off of what you were saying, but because we're asking, we wish we had more details about how Joseph processed all this. There's a lot of very unstated things in
Mhm.
the story that, historians would probably like to know.
Right. Or people have written books about trying to fill it in, kind of thing. But
Yeah.
five ways to overcome being in prison unjustly, something like that. Or
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If you want to use this as a self-help template or something like that, there's not a lot of details there. It
Right.
seems not to be the real point of the story. Though,
Hmm.
with that said, Joseph is going to make some revelations to his brothers after his father's death that are very theologically rich and give us a little window, but that we anticipate that. We should
Right.
probably get into chapter 42 here, where
Right.
we're in the midst of the famine. The
Yep.
good years for Joseph aren't over because he's still got a significant position in Egypt and he's a person of respect. But the nation is under stress now,
Hmm.
and the people are becoming desperate, as we'll see, because what Pharaoh ends up owning all the land.
Right. Well, they're dealing with massive immigration, if you would, or at least supply chain fatigue. if you should say, right?
Yeah, and we'll remind ourselves before we read chapter 42, verse 1, verse 57 says that all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, but the word there is not the word typically translated world. It's the word eretz, which means land. So it says all the land came to Joseph in Egypt, and that could imply all the earth, maybe, but I like land because he probably just means the whole region.
Mhm. Right. Any more than we'd say that all the people in this area went to this place or that place, or pretty much saying that there wasn't anything anywhere else. So
Yeah,
land
anybody
produces the food.
for whom Egypt was nearby, they were all coming to Egypt.
Hmm. This is where the food is.
Yeah. So let's go into chapter 42, and we'll read a little bit. You want to start this out? You can stop wherever you feel would be a good place to stop.
Sure. Yeah. It says when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another? I've heard," he said, "that there is grain in Egypt. Go down and buy some for us, or buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers, interesting Joseph there, huh? So
Yeah.
10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he feared that harm might come to him. Thus the sons of Israel were among the other people who came to buy grain, for the famine had reached the land of Canaan. It might be a good place to stop, don't you think? There's enough
Yeah,
to be.
there's a lot there. Yeah. Yeah. That last verse is interesting to me too. As you were reading it, it stood out to me differently than it had before. But yeah, so Jacob learns that there's grain in Egypt, and he says this phrase. We were discussing this a little bit before we started the podcast. Why do you keep looking at one another? That's a pretty good picture, right? When people
Yeah,
are nervous.
I think of the Jungle Book where it says, "Hey, what do you want to do?" "I don't know. What you want to do?" They're all looking at each other. So what are you going to do about this? It's an interesting. I think everybody's expecting somebody to do something.
Yeah.
Uh, there's 10 of them. It makes that pretty clear.
Yeah. And they're shepherds. So they're grazing sheep. And if there's no crops for them, no grasses or whatever for these animals to eat, what are they going to do?
Mhm.
So this might be a way of why are you twiddling your thumbs here? Why aren't you doing anything?
Mhm.
If there's no food for the crops, we can go get some
Right. Or for the animals, you mean?
for the animals. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's also
They're
interesting.
going to have to buy a lot of grain, given that I'm assuming Jacob is as prosperous as he was the last time we met him, where he came out with all Laban's animals. You're going to need a lot of grain. I'm
Mhm.
guessing that during this famine, they lost a lot of animals, but we're not told that either.
Well, they're not starving from it says there, the grain. It says so that we may live and not die. So it sounds, yeah, it's a tough situation. And I know a lot of the herds too. I learned some of that from studying about the shepherd, how they separated the sheep from the goats, and the main reason why they did that was that sheep were particular and only ate certain types of vegetation, where
Hmm.
the goats would eat all kinds of different variation at least. So the it I have some other questions about that, but they are sheep herders, shepherders.
Yeah,
Uh,
it
it's
almost sounds the way you're describing it like goats are a little hardier.
Yeah, they can eat certain vegetation. So the famine, I think what they're really talking about is this is the food that people eat, you know.
So
So
you're
much.
thinking maybe the animals aren't as stressed as the people.
Right, right. I think that they couldn't grow the crops. One of the other things I learned too was that shepherds would never bring their flocks into the fields, because the fields it talks about, in the prophets, or whether it be Ezekiel or Jeremiah, one of the two, I can't remember right off the top of my head, but they would the bad shepherds would bring the animals into the fields, and they would trample the grain, and
Oh, so
it
you're
would
talking
ruin.
about crop fields,
Yeah, so a bad shepherd wouldn't care, just lead them anywhere. They could
right?
get a good meal, whereas the good shepherd would know that this food is for the people,
Right. Yeah, by
and
good you
so
mean like the moral shepherd,
yes,
the ethical
well,
shepherd.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
the
That's
grain.
interesting. So you're right. We're not told whether the animals really suffered here or not. It depends on what's causing the famine, which again, we're not told. If it's a drought, certainly affect everything, but it could be something else like pestilence or disease that's killing off the crops. We just don't know.
Right. But it does say that we may live and not die.
Right.
So, I mean, that could be interpreted generically, like us as a people, but
It could
uh,
also be anthropocentric, where when people are starving, they care more about themselves than their animals, which is not always the case, but could
mhm.
be.
But they're not actually hurting because they have the money. They say they can buy the grain,
Right.
so that it's not like they're poor. They just don't have the grain.
Yeah. And this is a long trip to go from Canaan to Egypt, so it's no brief little journey.
Hmm.
I mean, it took the Israelites 40 years, but that's because they wandered a bit.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's going to be at least a week's journey or more to make
Hmm.
it, depending on, I'm guessing they're not taking animals with them, so I'm sure they can move quicker. But
Right. Yeah. They're going by donkey. We find that out later. But the one of the things I think is very interesting, though, is we are talking about them being shepherds and taking care of livestock in their homeland. But why does all 10 of them go?
yeah, isn't that an interesting
I mean,
decision, right? It
that
leaves
means,
only Benjamin and Jacob. Maybe they had servants, but it is interesting that all of them would go. I agree.
right.
I have no idea why that decision was made, but
Well,
I have some
and
speculations. I don't know for certain.
yeah, I tend to think that, they wanted to give all the account and the comparison between the 12 and Benjamin, but it is interesting that he sends them to get grain, but who's watching all the livestock?
Right.
Is it Dinah? Dinah's taking care of them all? Because it's just her and Benjamin left.
Yeah. Well, I think they had other daughters that are not mentioned probably, but they must have had servants. I mean, this may be an indication that they're very wealthy, but I'm still struggling with why Jacob. I mean, you already said narratively, it turns out that it works really well because it leaves Benjamin at home and Joseph wondering what happened to his brother. He can see all 10 of the other ones, but he can't see that one. So narratively, it works out. And if we were just making this story up, which some people accuse the prophets of doing, maybe it's just a rhetorical technique, but I do take it as history. I'm assuming that the 10 did go. And so I'm asking myself the question, why would Jacob do that? And the only thing I can think of is that he's genuinely afraid of sending anyone alone anymore after the death of Joseph.
Hmm.
Like, I wonder if there's an overreaction. You might say, well, he could just send two or three, but maybe there also could be the fact that these are all dispensable to him, and the only one that matters is Benjamin, and so he doesn't care about their safety. You could have that, or you could have the gun shy. Last time I sent Joseph out to find his brothers by himself, he died, so I'm going to send all 10 of them. They can watch each other's backs. I don't know. It's very hard. Again, this is a story with so many interesting details that get no explanation at all.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting though that the writer introduces it with Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, and then jumps to the part where it says, so the ten brothers of Joseph, or Joseph's brothers, they're stepbrothers or half brothers, they go down, and then it goes back to saying Jacob didn't want to send Joseph's brother Benjamin. It's like it's overly trying to make a distinction.
It's very clear that Joseph is at the front of this story. And even here, he remains at the front of it in the
Mhm.
way it's being told, right? Would you agree?
Oh yeah, but then also verse 5 says, "Thus the sons of Israel." So the transition between Jacob's sons, or Jacob, which means, his name means deceiver or supplanter, those kinds of things, to the sons of Israel, or the sons who struggle with God, or the sons who wrestle with God, because and maybe that's like foreshadowing what they have done to Joseph. This is what they're going to struggle.
Yeah, and there's something formulaic going on that can be hard to pin down. I took a class in my undergraduate called Biblical Narrative, and it was an English class with an English professor who was a believer. It was a very interesting class. We spent a lot of time in Genesis looking at these stories as narratives and trying to interpret them narratively, like as if you were reading any other work of fiction. And that led to a lot of controversy. My teacher never said it was fiction. He just said there was a lot of benefit to reading it as you would read a piece of fiction, looking at the narrative techniques. And in
Mhm.
one of, I think there were several lectures, his name was Paul Borgman. He ended up writing a book called Genesis, the Story We Haven't Heard, which I think is still available for purchase, where some of this might be fleshed out. But I got it from him in a class. And he spent a lot of time talking about the change in this paragraph from the name Jacob to the name Israel,
Oh.
which is unusual. Jacob is named Israel much earlier in the story.
Mhm.
He's renamed by God, but he's almost never called Israel. He continues to be called Jacob throughout the rest of the story, not exclusively as we see here, but very commonly. So when the author chooses to call him Israel, my professor, Paul Borgman, suggested we stop and ask why the change of name. And that's what you're doing. It's
Mhm.
pretty astute observation that the name changed, and I'm not sure why. My professor suggested that they used the name Israel anytime Jacob was representative of the chosen people of God.
Mhm.
When it wasn't Jacob as an individual being focused on, but Jacob as an idea, as
Mhm.
a patriarch, as a bigger picture kind of thing. And maybe he's right about that. That's possible. That the sons of Israel is meant to capture the bigger, larger family of Abraham from a cosmic or national point of view. Whereas when we're talking about the individual Jacob, he's called Jacob. I don't know how you feel about that, but that is
Yeah.
what he suggested in those lectures. And I've often thought about that. It makes some sense to me.
Yeah. I wondered if my point was, I was wondering if it's trying to summarize when you say thus. Usually, they're trying. I know it's a translational thing, but the idea that they're gonna the foreshadow is it's not going to be easy
Right. Yeah.
for
And
them.
that tying into what Paul Borgman had suggested, sons of Israel then would become a way of saying Israelites. It's
Mhm.
not meaning the sons of Jacob as opposed to the brothers of Joseph. It's just a summary statement as of Israelites. So the
Yeah.
Israelites came along with the other nations, but rather than calling them Israelites, because these are the actual sons of Israel, not the descendants of those sons, he
Yeah.
calls them the sons of Israel. But the reason for the name change is because this is a national way of talking about them as opposed to just the individual children of Jacob.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to emphasize the foreshadowing of
Mhm.
of who they will become.
Who they'll become. And that's similar to what he was saying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and as well as it's not going to be easy when they get to Egypt.
Right. Yeah, and they're nothing special either.
Yeah.
They're part of a huge number of pilgrims
Mhm.
from all over the land. So they're not the only ones going.
Oh, that's what you're focusing on. Okay,
Yeah,
that it's
Israelites are going along with all these other nations. Everybody's going to buy grain.
right. Okay, okay.
Joseph is the governor. That word is shalit. It means to have mastery over. It can also mean to domineer in its verb form. So governor is probably as good a title as anything. This is the only use of that particular form of this word in the book of Genesis.
Okay.
And it only the next time it occurs in the First Testament is in the book of Ecclesiastes. So it's a pretty rare word.
Mm.
And he was the one selling to all the people. It's amazing he was doing this personally. Do you find that amazing?
Yeah, especially in this story too, because it's almost like he was directly involved with everything. It's overwhelming to think that is actually true. I mean, if there was that many people coming, yeah,
Yeah.
he would have been at the table saying, "Okay, yeah, check him off. I got."
Right.
Yeah.
So I need to, before we move into this verse 6, where we're kind of already graduated, there are some folks who may have listened to these discussions. We had 38 discussions in 2020, which was 3 years ago. But
Mhm.
there may be others who are just picking up the series now as we're revisiting it some 3 years later. Maybe we should catch people up on the significance of Benjamin.
Yeah. Okay. So Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he feared that harm might come to him. So Jacob's wife Rachel had two sons, and Benjamin and Joseph were her sons.
He has more than one wife. He has two wives and two concubines. And Rachel is the one he loved.
Yes, the original one, that one that he really wanted.
That's the one he wanted to marry. Yeah, that's a long story, right? How he was tricked into marrying Leah. But we feel bad for Leah. I remember when we talked about that all those years ago, we spent a lot of time kind of mourning for Leah because it was a really unfair situation that she got caught into. But from Jacob's perspective, he was deceived into marrying her, and he really wanted to marry Rachel, who only had the two sons. And as far as Jacob knows, Joseph is dead. So he's very protective of the last remaining child of Rachel.
Yeah. Do we know the meaning of? I know there was probably a point where we did, but the meaning of Benjamin,
Son
is
of
there?
my right hand. And Joseph it comes from a verb meaning to add.
Yeah.
And Joseph's name was Rachel's prayer that God would give her another son. Can you imagine being born and named, "May I have another, please"? But that's
Well,
Joseph, means to add. "May the Lord add to me more children," is what she meant to name Joseph. But Benjamin means son of my right hand.
or she meant that Joseph was to be an actuary.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
he is right at this point. And we read later too that he doesn't want him to go there at all.
And maybe that's part of the reason he sends all 10 sons. Maybe he just didn't trust any of them around Benjamin. I think
And
it's an overreaction to the death of Joseph and such a long journey, so many perils.
well, for Jacob, as a parent, I could. It's got to be difficult to think that maybe all your kids would be swooped up in one
Right. Yeah,
one.
I still find it a very strange decision, and one that maybe the author didn't know why he made that decision, only that he did.
Mhm.
Or God certainly doesn't have seem to feel the need to inform us why.
Yeah, it's maybe a couple things. One or two thoughts. Maybe the first about the 10 may reveal either one thing, that there was a large amount or quantity of items that needed to be purchased, but also that maybe the second point, maybe that they were desperate.
When Abraham sent somebody to look for a wife for Rebecca for Isaac, and he found Rebecca, he sent a servant. It's a dangerous journey, difficult. He wasn't going to send his son. I still think Jacob sending all 10 of these boys shows that he thought of them as servants,
Mm.
that he didn't think of them as a father should think of sons. I think they were expendable to him. I'm just guessing.
Mm.
And I think he's sending them to do servants' work. Clearly, they have as many animals as we've been told earlier in the story. Somebody has to watch those animals. So he must have had servants watching them. So why not send the servants to Egypt? Why put his sons at risk? My professor, Paul Borgman, as I said, and I don't want to make him the feature of our discussion, but he thought several times during the story that Jacob suspected that they had conspired to kill Joseph, and he was still making them pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And his evidence for that is much later in the story when Jacob blesses his sons.
Mm-hmm.
He calls Judah a lion's whelp that tears the prey. And that's what Judah said happened to Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
And it made it sound like Jacob may have suspected all the way through that these brothers had done something, that they were somehow involved in Joseph's death. And the fact that he's sending all 10 of them on a servant's mission might indicate that he's still making them pay for it.
You're onto something there, I think.
My sense is when Jacob comes to them and he's like, "What are you all sitting around here for? I heard there's grain in Egypt. Why don't you go get it?" I think the sons are like, "Us? Like, you want us to go?
Yeah.
Like all of us?" Like,
Yeah.
and they're looking at each other.
Yeah. Me? Talking to me?
We have like 50 servants out there. You want us to go to Egypt? Just the 10 of us?
Right.
All right. I think there's some family dynamics at work here, is my suspicion. So Joseph, as we get to verse 6, Joseph is governor over the land. He's selling food to all the people who come. There's some sort of personal oversight. Now, he might not have been doing it individually, but he's clearly there overseeing it because he sees his brothers come. So Joseph's brothers came, they bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Now, Joseph recognizes them immediately, but he doesn't reveal that.
Mm-hmm.
The text says he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them.
Mm-hmm.
"Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And although Joseph had recognized his brothers, so this is important, it's been repeated twice,
Mm-hmm.
they did not recognize him. Joseph also remembered the dreams that he had dreamed about them. So Joseph remembers that they were going to bow before him, and that's what's happening, right?
Yeah.
So he said to them, "You're spies. You've come to see the nakedness of the land." So we'll stop there just for a moment because we had spent some time thinking about this. I'm curious what your thoughts are now after our conversation. The word for nakedness there is not a common one in the book of Genesis. It's the word erva, and it means genitals. More or less, it means genitals. That's what it refers to. It's often used of women, more often of women in the Bible than men, but not entirely. And in the book of Genesis, the only other time this word is used is in the aftermath of the flood, when Ham, the son of Noah, goes into his father when he's drunk, and it says he sees his father's nakedness, more literally, his father's genitals. And then he goes out and tells his brothers, and they come in and cover their father. That's the only other use of this particular word in Genesis. And you had mentioned to me, and I'll just cover this quickly, doesn't it say in the creation account of man and woman that at first they were naked and had no shame? And it does, and it may be related to this word, but it's not the same word. That word actually does mean to have nothing, to be without possessions, or to be naked. This one seems a little bit more on point. So you're spies, you've come to see the land's genitals. What do you think is at stake in that accusation? It's clearly meant to be indecent. They've come to do something indecent. But how are you processing that accusation?
It seems a little bit bizarre. I mean, you could think about vulnerability. You could think of this idea of overpowering or taking over or trying to find out the secret behind what had happened there. It seems that Joseph is drawing. He's trying to divert, I would say, more so his own feelings about the fact that he recognizes his brothers, and he knows that they don't recognize him. But the idea that his brothers have come. I mean, what do spies do? Spies look to find ways to dominate or to be the ones in control, or get important information to help their side.
We should probably remember that the land of Canaan in this time period was a land bridge between all the competing superpowers of the day. So you could cross the Mediterranean Sea, as you said earlier in our conversation, but that could be dangerous. Storms, piracy. It was not a controlled waterway. In
Mhm.
fact, it's really the Romans that bring the Mediterranean Sea under the most control. It
Mhm.
becomes the most prosperous trade route, not more prosperous than others, but probably the most prosperous from this point until the Romans under Rome's rule because of their naval superiority. But it's pretty dangerous. So a lot of people didn't take goods that way. You couldn't cross the Saudi Arabian desert, what we call the Arabian desert today. You couldn't cross that, not easily. But this little strip of land connected the Babylonians, the Persians, the Hittites, and the Egyptians. So it's a key trade route. And so the accusation that spies might be coming from there to see if there are any vulnerabilities in Egypt or to see things that people aren't supposed to see, that might be a sustainable claim.
Mhm.
Now, it might be one that would have stayed with the Egyptians. Some
Right.
claims seem out of order or impossible to sustain, and you might think, oh, that's just a spurious claim. But this one might have had some teeth. Joseph may have hit him right where it counts.
Yeah, you're trying to steal the way we prospered.
Yeah, you're here to find out if we have any tender spots.
Mhm.
And he might be accusing them of being emissaries of any number of nations that would have passed through Canaan and might have hired them as mercenaries, whether they're, I think at this time, maybe the Hittites
Mhm.
would be the more dominant rivals for the Egyptians. But I think it's a pretty substantial claim. This is
Yeah.
not what you would want to hear from the leader of Egypt when you come to buy grain. This is probably the worst accusation imaginable.
Right. Right. Shoots right at him. Yeah.
Yeah, and he knows exactly who they are,
Hmm.
and they don't have a clue who he is. And it's been a lot of years. So it's probably not surprising he's dressed as an Egyptian, living as an Egyptian in a leadership position in Egypt, and he was very young when they sold him into slavery. So it's not surprising they don't recognize him. But
Right.
you have a sense that he's been waiting for them, looking for them.
Yeah. That's why what we were saying before, it's like it's very, very difficult for us to think that he was like looking out for them. But I would think that obviously they haven't changed very much, but that the amount of people coming from all over the place, and if there were that many people that came to buy, it sounds as though he had opportunity to see them, to recognize them, and they didn't recognize him. Obviously, like you said before, he was in Egyptian clothes. He took his bath. He's a married man. He's got two children.
Right,
They would have never expected that he would have got to this point. That's
right.
the thing. That's what it's really giving giving us the notice to, is that they would never have thought.
Their response to him is, again, I have so many questions about this story. Why do they give him so many details? But he said to them, no, you've come to see the nakedness of the land. They said, we, your servants, are 12 brothers,
Hmm.
the sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan. The youngest, however, is now with our father, and one is no more. Jacob is perplexed by this later. We'll see. He says, why did you tell them you had a brother?
Right.
And I'm asking the same question. Why do they present themselves as 12? Joseph's been dead for years from their perspective, or he's gone.
Hmm.
And why do they feel the need to tell him about Benjamin? What is this sudden gushing of facts and information? How do you make of it?
Well, yeah, I think they're reacting to this like a lot of us do when somebody says, "Well, you're lying," or "You're a spy." Well, immediately we got to prove our honesty. We have to become clear. And
You think it's rooted in a fear response?
oh yeah, yeah, they're definitely afraid. They're definitely afraid.
And they can't filter anything. They're gushing information at this point, right?
Yeah, you could imagine them one by one. Each a phrase. They're all 10 of them.
This is a summary, right? I
Yeah.
imagine that how it might have spilled out is, well, we're 10 sons. No, 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 we're 12. Well, we were 12, but one of them is gone. Yeah, and we left one at home. So I guess we're technically 12, and our father's in Canaan. They don't want to say who he is. Why don't they? They're gushing information. They don't say his name's Jacob. You
Right.
know,
Right.
it does strike you as very realistic, right? Just a fear, panicky, weird gushing of information at the accusation. And you can see why, because this is a big accusation. These guys
Yeah.
are in big trouble if they
So
can't prove otherwise.
so no longer are they looking at each other. Now they're quick talking. Nobody's really lying. That's what's interesting about it, because they're really saying everything that, as far as we know, is true to the story. As far as they're concerned, Joseph is dead. Because they have no idea.
So they're gushing this information, and Joseph says to them in verse 14, it's just as I've said to you, you're spies. Like he doesn't buy their story, he's saying, I know you're lying.
Yeah, yeah.
The story doesn't even seem credible. How could this be true?
Is that the best you got? That's what he said.
Yeah. So he's like, all right, we're going to test your word. Let's see
Yeah,
if this is true. If you're really 12 brothers, one's missing, another one's at home, all sons of the same father, I don't buy it. So, and I don't know. I don't know how big families were in these days, but one thing I will say, and we've been talking about this the whole time, the idea that a father would send his 10 sons to go collect grain is weird. And I think Joseph is saying, nobody's going to buy that story.
right.
So let's see if you're
Yeah.
telling me the truth. So here's how it's going to be tested. As Pharaoh lives, you'll not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. So he's saying, let's prove
Mhm.
that there is this other brother. Let one of you go and bring your brother, while the rest of you remain in prison, in order that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. Or else, as Pharaoh lives, surely you are spies. And he put them in prison for 3 days.
Mhm.
So again, Joseph is being mean. Do you think? Like, what do you make of Joseph's behavior? You think this is right?
It seems pretty intensive. I mean, it's like if these other people showed up, and it's like, that you'd think they'd be saying, "Is he like this with everybody?" It seems pretty intense, and then makes those comments. As sure as Pharaoh lives, is almost like isn't that almost like a cuss word, or like, and the idea that they're being tested is certainly true. They, like, you get thrown into jail for 3 days, you're going to come out with the same story, because he's not buying the first one.
I was saying, is this mean? Because it seems like Joseph is being cruel, but my real instincts are to say that Joseph is very concerned for the safety of his brother and for his father. These 10 guys conspired to sell him into slavery, and they've not proven trustworthy. He had a younger brother. What's happened to him? And what's happened to their father? Why are all 10 of them here? This is a bizarre thing. I think Joseph sees him and he's like, something doesn't add up.
Right.
Like, these 10 guys are all here, but my brother's not with them. Where's my father? And why are they here? Why did he not send servants? I'm wondering if anybody else sent all of their children to collect grain. I bet you every other powerful person in this region sent servants.
Yeah.
So this probably stands out to Joseph. I think he may be treating them harshly because he is desperately afraid that something has happened to Benjamin and that something's happened to his father.
Yeah. He's definitely gonna bring that out, and it's contrast with him gaining control, compared to the lack of control he had before, when they threw him in the cistern, or
Yeah,
they weren't just willing to sell him into slavery. They were going to kill him at first.
right. So you're thinking there's a little vengeance here, a little sour grapes?
I don't think it's that so much he's really, like, I think you were onto something by saying, he wants to really test these guys. He wants to prove. He wants to see if how much, or if there's been any change in them at all. If they were willing to sell him into slavery, what did they've done with father and brother, like you said,
Yeah.
or even the rest of the family? I mean,
I think there's a panic in Joseph here. And I know it's not stated, so we're reading between the lines, but this is a story where most of it is left up to us to decide motivations. We're not really told much. But if it were me and I saw these 10 guys stroll into town, I'd want to know that my brother was okay, and I'd want to know what happened to my father.
hmm.
And he has found a way to ensure that he will find out. He's said, you're all going to stay here until one of you brings back this brother. I mean, what he really wants to know, if he wanted to reveal himself, he would say, where's dad and where's my brother?
Right.
Like, I think that's what he wants to know.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't want to give away who he is yet. So this is his tact.
Well, he certainly takes control of the situation, and he's also able to contain them. And when he puts them in prison, he has control over what they do or where they're at, or you know, the process in which they're going to have to reveal some of this stuff. So it's I see Joseph as this. It's just obviously a total role
Yeah,
reversal.
there's no doubt that it is.
I
I
mean,
just wonder what's motivating it. I think it's fear and concern for his father and brother. It could be sour grapes though, or maybe it's a mix of the two. Maybe he is one good turn to. I stayed a little while in that cistern. Why don't you just sweat it out in prison here? And Joseph leaves them there. He doesn't interact with them for 2 of those days.
mm-hmm.
And then it says on the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, do this and you'll live, for I fear God,
Right.
Elohim. An interesting phrase because the Egyptians are polytheists. Certainly the brothers of Joseph, I think the whole region was familiar with Egyptian beliefs. This could be translated, I fear the gods. But all the translations I'm aware of translate this singularly. And I think the reason they do it is because there's a definite article, the,
Mm-hmm.
on
Mm-hmm.
this Elohim, the Elohim. It still could be translated, though, for I fear the gods.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, we know that Joseph means it singularly,
Mm-hmm.
but I wonder if they heard it singularly. Because it's an Egyptian saying it, they might have heard, he's just saying, I fear the gods. I don't want to get into divine trouble here by treating you unjustly. So if you're honest men, let one of your brothers stay here while you're in prison, where you are in prison now, and the rest of you can go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. So he'll, instead of keeping them all and letting one go get his brother, he
Mm-hmm.
keeps one behind and he lets them all go. That's what he suggests.
But the for I fear God, I think that's part of the cover for Joseph. If he says the gods, it's part of the cover because he's still not wanting to reveal to them who he is.
Yeah. And of course, the name Yahweh or Jehovah, I am, has not been revealed to Israel yet, but it is used by Moses and the prophetic tradition of Israel in the book of Genesis. Even though it's not revealed until Exodus, they do put that name into the mouths of the patriarchs whenever they're talking about the one true God.
Mm-hmm.
And so Yahweh could be used here if he was talking about the specifically Jewish God, even though it's not technically revealed till Exodus. We do see the name used in Genesis. Even more, the most common nomenclature for God for Abraham is El Shaddai.
Mm.
So that's God Almighty. It's often translated, though it probably doesn't mean that. Probably means God the nurturer. But in any case, he could have said, I fear El Shaddai, and that would have been much more Abrahamic. So Elohim is still very general. So
Mm-hmm.
you're right. He's not giving away too much here. He might have meant it one way and they could have heard it another very easily. So in verse 21, we find out that they've been speaking to him in Egyptian, I guess, or whatever language the Egyptians used in these days. But when they talked amongst themselves, they spoke in Hebrew.
Right.
Or whatever derivation of Hebrew was present at that time. And they didn't think he could understand them because they're talking right in front of him.
Right. Right.
And so Reuben speaks up right in the midst of this. And he says, did I not tell you not to wrong the boy? He's still remembering Joseph. This was ages ago.
Right.
They still feel guilty. At least Reuben does.
Mm-hmm.
but you wouldn't listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. We're paying for what we did to our brother. Can you imagine all these? They still haven't forgiven themselves,
Yeah. Well,
which is good. I wouldn't want them to.
there's definitely a tension among the 10 in regards to this. Isn't that specifically why Simeon is the one who's bound?
But verse 23, before we get to that, they didn't know that Joseph understood them, since he spoke with them through an interpreter.
Right.
And he turned away from them and wept. So
Right.
he separates himself because he heard what he said. I just find that it's almost a trope in some movies, right? Where two people speak in a language that they think somebody doesn't understand, and then the person just pipes up and says, "What did you just say?"
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's why it's interesting with verse 18, where it says, "On the third day, Joseph said to them, 'Do this, and you will live, for I fear God.'" You assume in that passage or that verse that Joseph is the actual one speaking, but is it the interpreter that's actually telling them that?
He's translating from Egyptian, whatever language it is that they're speaking in Egypt at this time, or whatever version of Egyptian, translating it into Proto-Hebrew or Ugaritic or whatever it is. Why
So,
do you think he picked Simeon?
well, I was trying to look into that before, and I was trying to understand Simeon's role in the whole selling of their brother, and whether or not he was one of the main instigators to sell him as opposed to killing him. But it definitely, what I recall, definitely Reuben was wanting to save him, and so that's what I was trying to decipher. So maybe you have some insight into that.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't say for certain, but I suspect that Joseph thought Simeon was the heir. And I think he thought that because Simeon is the second born after Reuben. And Joseph may have been old enough to realize that Reuben and his father were at odds, because we already knew that by the time Joseph left. And he
Mm-hmm.
probably knew that Reuben was not going to be the heir. But the next born is Simeon, then Levi, then Judah. And it's not super clear that Simeon and Levi have been rejected. That won't really happen until Jacob reveals how he felt about their little incident in Shechem, which is going to be later.
Mm-hmm.
During their blessing and curses, it's very clear that because they did that, he was passing them over. So Judah's the actual heir from Leah's side.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Joseph thought it was Simeon. So I think that's why he held him.
Yeah, well, it's a little confusing too, because I think Judah was. Am I wrong? Wasn't he part of the suggestion of selling
It was
him?
Judah's idea to sell him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I think he believed Simeon to be the heir, and holding him was holding Israel hostage. So
I
I think
follow
that's
that.
what he thought. Probably a shock to Joseph that Jacob let Simeon stay there for a good long time. I think that's a surprise to Joseph. And I wonder if he feared that Benjamin had already been killed when he saw how long Simeon was kept there.
Right.
But I think he thought he was grabbing the heir. These interfamily politics might seem very distant to us because we don't care who first or second or third born is. That's not how we do inheritance. But Jacob is a substantial man with a great fortune, and whoever's going to inherit the double portion and the blessing is going to be the head of a very large, powerful family. And so that's all over this. That's why they got rid of Joseph to begin with. And
Mm-hmm.
Joseph seems to suspect, and he may have heard the whole argument with Reuben where Reuben tried to spare him. But
Mm-hmm.
next in line is Simeon, as far as Joseph knows. We'll
Yeah.
find out later that Judah is the real threat to Joseph, but I don't think Joseph knew that.
Yeah. Well, as far as inheritance goes and the blessing, that sort of stuff.
And the one who was trying to get rid of him, it was
Right.
really Judah.
Yeah.
We know why. I mean, those of us who are reading the story from outside, we know why Judah was so at odds with Joseph because Judah seems he's older than Joseph. He knows the politics of the family. And I think he's fully aware that Simeon and Levi are going to be passed over. And he knows he's next in line and Joseph is his only rival. I think that's there in Judah's suggestion to get rid of him. But Joseph is younger. And from his perspective, Simeon is second born. I think that's why he holds him. If he had known Judah was the real threat, I think he would have held Judah. And the reason I make such a big deal of this is there's a confrontation with Joseph and Judah coming that's going to mean more if you understand this.
Yeah, well, in a Genesis overarching story, though, the story of Judah and Tamar is put in there as well, isn't it?
It is because Judah becomes such an important ruler. And as we follow the whole history of Israel, the Davidic line comes from the tribe of Judah. And then the line of kings that rule the northern kingdom of Israel once they split, those are in the lines of Joseph's children, Ephraim and Manasseh. So this is a long time feud, Joseph and Judah. But at this point of the story, Joseph isn't quite aware of the way Judah has improved in the family lineage because Joseph has been gone.
Right.
Even though Simeon and Levi had done what they did to the Shechemites while Joseph was still there, he was a kid and he may not have realized exactly how his father felt about that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it might have been conflicting too because it seemed like justice to some degree.
Yeah, exactly. So Joseph may not have seen Simeon and Levi as the villains that his father did. But once we get to the blessings in 50 or thereabouts, we'll see how Jacob really felt about Simeon and Levi. And I think Judah already knew.
Right. Right.
Yeah, so that's a lot of politics, but it's all behind this story. But that's my suspicion is why he held Simeon, but we're not really told overtly. So I guess there could be other reasons.
Can't skate over the fact that in verse 24, though, we should probably talk about that. He was emotional about it, though. Joseph was. It says he turned away from them and wept, and he returned to speak to them. In other words,
there must have been some validation for Joseph that they still carried the guilt.
Yeah.
At least Reuben did. One
Right.
thing that does need to be pointed out, we're from a culture where historically, and I think this is changing today, but historically, men were supposed to not show a lot of emotion. And so if you were weeping as a man, it could be seen in European history as a type of weakness or as it makes the situation very, very extreme. Like if a man loses it in public, it must be extreme. His emotions must be very, very strong.
Right.
But in the ancient Near East, men weeping was a very common and expected part of the emotional timber. So Joseph weeping is not necessarily an indication of an exceptional circumstance. All it means is that what Reuben said touched him.
Yeah, I mean, as rough as the situation it was at hand, I'm sure he was quite overwhelmed by the circumstances. I mean, he probably thought he'd never see these guys ever again. Do you think he was shocked by when you were saying that they wronged the boy, and he said, "But you wouldn't listen to me, so now there comes a reckoning for his blood." Do you feel like that, like he's reflecting and Reuben's reflecting, saying this is divine justice?
Yeah. He suspects God is involved in this. And remember, they are children of Abraham. They have been taught about the one true God, and they do have some knowledge of what this God has done. So Reuben sounds like he's been waiting for the other shoe to fall for years. And now it's happening.
It's tough stuff.
So he takes Simeon, binds him before their eyes, and then he gives orders to fill their bags with grain and to return the money that they paid for it and to give them extra provisions for their journey. And it's done for them. So Joseph, after all that, he really lavishes on some blessings to them. How do you process that? Like, how did they process that?
He knows that there's people starving back home.
Yeah.
there's no bread. There's no, not like us today where there's food everywhere you go, but it's like bread was their main thing, wasn't it? I
Right.
mean,
Oh yeah, bread and what we might call beer today, or some sort of distilled um, thing made from bread and water that could see them through really lean times and would last a long time because of the antibacterial properties of it. That's the stuff they lived on.
mhm.
They don't know yet that he's put their money back in their bags, but he
Mhm.
did give them provisions for the journey on top of the grain, which seems lavish to me by itself. And they knew
Mhm.
he did that,
Yeah. Well, he wanted to ensure that Benjamin was going to come back,
right?
but he has given, should we say that giving them quite a bit is a
Yeah,
risk. There's a risk involved here if they're as shady as they were.
there is a risk, and he's also giving them a chance to repeat history because if Simeon is the heir and Benjamin's already been dealt with, which I think he suspects, then he's giving them an opportunity to get rid of Simeon just like they got rid of him. Right. So he's almost putting them back in the same position to test and see if this squabbling for dad's favor, which is really, in our day, we might think they're looking for dad's approval, dad's love, but really this story is about looking for dad's money.
Mhm.
And if that's really what it's all about, they might never come back.
Mhm.
If Benjamin's dead and he's keeping Simeon, well, Levi would have a lot of reason not to go back.
Right. They had better not come back if that be the case. 'Cause
Right. Oh yeah. If Benjamin's dead, he's never going to see him again.
the test has gone full cycle.
Yeah, so
That'd be
they travel they travel a little bit of distance and we don't know how far, but they stop to feed the animals. So it's probably a little ways. And when one of them, we're not told who, opens his sack to give his donkey food, he saw his money was at the top of his sack. And what do
hmm
you take, I mean, of their response? What is
Yeah,
this that God has done to us?
right. They see it as a curse.
Yeah, they think God's trying to get him killed, right?
Woo.
Reuben's language is ringing in their ears.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
God's going to get us killed. He put our money back. They're going to think we stole. They really think God did this.
Yeah. If God,
Never,
if
it still
Joseph,
has not crossed their mind that the guy they just bought the grain from is messing with them.
yeah,
Right?
right.
That hasn't even crossed their mind,
They see it as divine judgment.
as
As
they should. They
yeah,
live in a world where they believe God is going to intervene in the course of their lives to make right what went wrong, and now they think it's happening. And it is God in a way through Joseph.
Mhm. But they're
Yeah,
trembling. They're trembling. They lose
yeah,
heart and turn trembling.
yeah. And this word for charad it means to be terrified, to be ashamed. It's used for the quaking or shaking of a mountain in the case of an earthquake. Pretty good word.
Yeah. What is this that God has done this to us? Do you think at all what they're gonna say to dad? We got the grain, but we got the money too.
And this is the singular God. Even though it could be translated gods, this one, the verb associated with it is singular. So they're speaking as good children of Abraham about the one God.
Mm,
The other thing that we know in hindsight is that the Israel becomes the 12 tribes of Israel, that somehow all 12 of these brothers receive the birthright and the blessing, that somehow they're all included.
mm,
And that's not something Genesis has prepared us to expect because there was Isaac and Ishmael, and only Isaac was chosen. There were Jacob and Esau, and only Jacob was chosen. So if we're reading the story well, we expect one of these sons to be the heir, not
mm,
all of them, right? Abraham had a lot of children,
mm.
right? He only had Isaac from Sarah, but he had a lot of children.
Right.
He had Ishmael, but then he had other sons too. We talked about Midian and all the others that were born from his second wife, but only Isaac inherits. we're kind of cued in Genesis to ask ourselves the question, which one of these 12 sons of Jacob will be the next Isaac, will be the next Jacob? And we know in hindsight that all 12 of them get included in that, but there's no way in Genesis to anticipate that. And the sons wouldn't have known that. They think they're all vying for that birthright and blessing, which is their family history. So we know that they're all 12 going to be included in this future. I think one of the questions that the story begs is, how is that going to happen? They clearly don't know that. And how is that going to materialize? How is it that all 12 of them are going to receive the promises made to Abraham when in the past only one brother ever got it? So that's kind of this open question that, reading in hindsight, we know, but how is it going to occur? This is the story that answers that question, but that's kind of looming out there for us.
Right. That's well said. If anything's been exposed in these passages, even through this to this point in Genesis, is that the Bible doesn't try to excuse any kind of dysfunctional families. And, I mean, it exposes them to help us to realize how difficult circumstances can get, and some by our own choices, well, mostly our own choices, and reveals more and more how we walk with God through it.
I agree. And I think there's also a dynamic in here for those of us who are parents or who one day will be blessed with the ability to be a parent, that we can cause a lot of problems when we don't figure out how to love all of our children. Playing favorites can be an easy and tempting thing to do, especially if you have a difficult child or a willful one, or maybe some people are inclined to like sons better than daughters, daughters better than sons, or firstborn better than secondborn, or maybe some were the youngest in their family, so they dote on the youngest. Whatever it is, we all can be tempted based on personality or some other criteria to treat our children, to treat one or two as more special than the others. And we see that in this dynamic. And one thing I keep asking myself is, what might Isaac have done differently? What might Jacob have done differently to help head off some of this? And obviously they're in a different culture because they did have to decide who was going to be their heir. And so that's always part of this process. And we don't do that, right? That's not part of our culture. But still, there's probably a lesson in here to not repeat the mistakes of the patriarchs in terms of how they set their children against each other. Yeah. Children are vying in this culture for their parents' money.
Yeah.
In our culture, it's for their parents' affection, attention, acceptance, right?
Yeah.
And how can we not make that an inter-sibling squabble? How can we work against that? I ask myself those questions when I read these stories.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I mean, when Jesus is baptized, I think about those things, that when we're doing his will, when we're doing what he's called us to do, that affirmation is so vital, in my opinion. I do remember those times where it wasn't my parents who told me, why can't you be more like your brother? It was someone else.
Well,
good points. I appreciate what you're saying.
Those are my final words as I think about this, and I'm anxious to find out in the story itself how these 12 are going to be reconciled to each other and all become the children of Abraham rather than just one of them.
Yeah. Do you think they ever resolve it? That's a good question, I think, huh? Right.
It's a tough family dynamic. Lots of mistakes. It's no wonder when the law of Moses is finally given to Israel that God outlaws the marrying of sisters the way Jacob did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's complex.
Yeah. And then thankfully, by the time of the New Testament, the Lord returns us to Eden, one man and one woman, rather than even this polygamous situation that he allows to go for centuries. We finally get back to Eden and Adam and Eve.
Back to the beginning.
Thank the Lord. Well, thank you, Joe. Thanks for joining me again.
Yes.
We thank you all who have joined us and are listening in again. And we'll continue until we finish Genesis.
Excellent. Thank you so much for listening.
We'll see you next time.